Welcome back, guys, to another Jar Academy podcast episode. As you can see, the scene here is a little bit different today. I am not on my comfy couch and Kitten is not with me. I am currently in Bali, but today we are going to be talking about wired for love. We hear this terminology all the time where it's like talking about wired for love or wired for protection, and that basically comes down to our nervous system. What people kind of mean with this is very nuanced because at the end of the day, we are all wired for protection. We're not wired for perception. We're not wired for understanding. It's like a survival instinct in our minds to be like, oh, threat. Like I'm going to go dysregulated. I'm going to hone in on that and really focus on it. However, over time, if we have a lot of unprocessed trauma or we haven't processed a lot of our past negative experiences or we haven't processed childhood or inconsistent childcare giving, we can become more wired for protection than others. And what I mean by like wired by protection is it ultimately means like we kind of see things as a threat more than maybe they should be. So when we are wired for protection, we are all wired for protection on some level. But when it starts to become this reactive or this kind of thing that controls and dictates our relationships, it ultimately keeps people out and it keeps them at a distance. And for ourselves, it can be a very frustrating experience because maybe we know better. Maybe we think like, why am I like this? Why is this happening? Why am I sabotaging so soon? Why am I pushing people away? Even though consciously it's like, I want this, but then I feel this reaction to do these things and I don't really know why. And then once you regulate and you come out of that experience, you're like, why did I do that? Like I reacted too soon. I responded so soon. And it's our own way of wanting to get what feels threatening away from us because the nervous system in relationships doesn't care about perception or understanding or all of these different things. What it cares about is I am dysregulated. There is a threat. And the safest thing for me to do right now is to remove that threat. And that can be done in many different ways. And it's very difficult because we can have this awareness. We can know that we want different, but then awareness doesn't change the nervous system. When you're working with the nervous system in your relationships and you're trying to really open yourself up for that more soft, secure love, you have to talk to the nervous system in a way that the nervous system understands. And that's ultimately by showing it, right? So it's kind of like this two-part thing. We get this awareness of like, okay, like here's how I'm being reactive. Here's how I am being controlling and softening our ego and seeing these areas that we are kind of in a way not falling short, but we're hindering ourselves. And then there's also the second part of where we have to learn now how to engage with our nervous system in a way that makes change. Because it's one thing to learn tools to self-regulate on our own, but it's another thing to then go back and be presented with the same opportunity and the same moment and practice it in real time. There's something called negative sentiment override, and you can kind of get this in two different ways. One would be with a partner, and let's say I meet them and I'm super happy and at the start, and then all these kind of like negative things kind of start to happen. And over time, I see more of my experience of them as negative, and I misinterpret positive or neutral signs as negative because I've already got a story in my head. So it's like kind of like a confirmation bias of being like, yeah, like no, by that they meant something bad because more often than not, that it's bad, if that makes sense. Now, the second way that this can happen is through a lot of past hurt, a lot of bad breakups, maybe a lot of false starts in dating, or we've been ghosted a lot, or we've been hurt a lot, and we end up basically creating these narratives and stories that all dating is bad. And obviously that's a very cognitive thing when we're thinking of like the stories, but ultimately what ends up happening is it shapes the way our nervous system works. And when I talk to people about working in their relationships, nervous system work never sounds sexy because it's not fun, but it is the biggest thing that will make a shift or a change in your nervous system. So over time, let's say that my nervous system becomes really kind of like wired for this certain way. I'm now becoming hypervigilant, both in my nervous system. So let's say that I have a partner and I'm sitting at a restaurant and they're running late. I automatically assume They don't care. Why do they always do this? This always happens to me. People don't respect my time. And I get really angry and I get really upset. The alternative to that is I go, oh my God, like my partner's late. Like, is he okay? Is there traffic? Like, what is happening? Should I call him? Should I wait? And that's the exact same experience, but two very different outlooks. And now when it's coming from a side of being in our relationship and maybe there's things that's happened with our partner, it's kind of shaped this way. That's one thing. But the other thing is when we become wired for protection and we're used to a lot more of this negative experience happening and our nervous system becomes really strung out, we ultimately will fall to the frustration and the rigidness and being annoyed and frustrated more than we will being the open and curious and wondering why, or what might be happening. Now, there are different signs that our nervous system has become more wired for protection, and that's our reactivity. So we are reacting to things that might necessarily be quite small. We are not very flexible in our nervous system. Nervous system flexibility is one of the biggest signs of a healthy nervous system. And what that basically means is that things can change. And it's like this ability to adapt and be adaptive and open and curious and not be rigid or strung and have this sense or need of control. The third one is control. So often when we are very strung out in our nervous system and we've been through a lot of negative experiences, we want to control the circumstances, not from a place of being bad or being mean or being awful, but because it feels safe. If I control the outcome and I know what's going to happen and when, I'm not leaving things open for someone to be able to come in and hurt me because I'm kind of dictating the narrative. I'm moving all the chess pieces. I know exactly what's going to happen and how that's going to feel. And a lot of the time we see this when, we hear like, she was so controlling or she was so this or that. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily something that she's just trying to be an awful human being. It's maybe there's something in the relationship that's making her feel unsafe. Maybe there's something that's happened in the past that's made her feel unsafe. Working with that nervous system response and working with that nervous system flexibility is what helps relinquish that need for control. Now this is where we can get a little bit nuanced with it because our nervous system can be very tricky. If you had asked me when I was stuck in a chronic stress response, for those that don't know, a chronic stress response basically means like you get so pushed outside your window of tolerance, you can't like regulate back into it. So I would just switch from like being so anxious to totally like shut down and depressed. And I would just oscillate between the two. And it, for me, caused me so many relationship issues. And I've definitely spoken about this on other episodes. But for today, that experience, if you had asked me then if I was wired for protection, I probably would have told you no. Because it's like our nervous system is like sneaky. It's like a door behind a door behind a door. It doesn't like to be outwardly open about like how dysregulated we might actually be or what we might actually be feeling. And these two nuanced ones is often rejecting compliments or rejecting the idea of love. And maybe you might consciously think like, no, I like compliments and I like love. But if someone's kind of, showing you this vulnerability and you kind of almost don't believe it, that's usually like a sign that your nervous system doesn't feel safe in that experience. So it has like a layer of protection of being like, it's almost like the words just bounce right off you, right? Like there's no human emotion connection to it. And the last one is accepting support. When we accept support, we almost have to make ourselves vulnerable in a way. We have to open ourselves up to this idea or this concept that we are relinquishing some of that control that makes our nervous system feel safe. And now I'm in this space where, again, things can go wrong or things like I might be disappointed or I might get my feelings hurt or all these things might happen, that it becomes a very anxious and rigid kind of experience in itself. So I've explained a little bit about what being wired for protection means. Now, obviously, working with the nervous system helps with these really little nuanced perspectives that I'm talking about and these little hiccups, but it also does still come back to our secure attachment. And not everything that dysregulates you is something to do with attachment in relationships. It's a very big part of it, but it's not everything to do with it. But the backbone of secure attachment is having a flexible nervous system. It's knowing that you can have these things that happen and then that you are able to regulate and kind of come back and you're able to move through this balance and go through it and adapt and change and be open. It's never about being perfectly regulated. If someone says to you, like, I am so wired for connection and not for protection, like, it's not true, okay? Because everyone on some level is wired for protection. And particularly as we go through our life and we become more stressed and different circumstances happening, we basically get pushed more and more outside of our window of tolerance. So if I have a cup, right, and let's say it's normally like a third full. Now, let's say I have a lot of big work projects. I've got, a family health crisis. I've got, different managers coming into my work. I've got all these different things happening. Now my cup might be 5/6 full. I have this tiny little bit of capacity that is available. So of course I'm going to be more wide for protection. Of course I'm going to be a little bit more rigid. Of course I'm going to have a lot more going on and not have the flexibility. And that doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. What we're looking for here is when it is becoming a full cup based on things that no longer are really relevant. When the past influences of our relationships are still impacting our present moment and it's not who we need to be bleeding onto. So, for example, if I had an incident when I was 16, and let's say that my boyfriend at the time really didn't, ever turn up on time and like would say he was coming and then not come and like was so flaky. And now I'm a 32-year-old woman and I meet this guy and he's late on our first date and I start reacting and getting frustrated and angry. And it's like, not even fully consciously, but my nervous system is reacting in a way that happened when I was 16. I don't really need to be hanging on to that experience anymore. I'm not a 16-year-old girl. I'm now a 32-year-old woman. I now have a lot more tools and strategies to regulate my nervous system. I don't need to have this high-strung frustration and anger and take it out on this person and ruin this opportunity to be very open to this new experience because of what happened back then. So the more that we work on this and we build this secure attachment, the more that we work on opening our nervous system up and being more open to love, the more we can actually soften into our relationships. And I definitely feel like for myself and anyone really that it's a genuine work in progress. Like it's not something, you don't go on your normal life journey as an individual and go, I went to a yoga class, now I'm Gandhi. You're not, it's this, you still have to keep going to yoga if you want the benefits long term of yoga. It's not a one-time thing and done. And yes, we can go and we can process a lot of this stuff and work on what's in our nervous system and open ourselves up more to love. But just because you open yourself up at the start doesn't mean that you are now perfectly open all of the time. It's very much this thing where we have to be quite conscious of like, what's coming up for me? What do I need to work on? Am I in a place where I'm not treating my partner the best at the moment? Is there something going on internally for me that is making me be more wired for protection right now? And that might be something that's within myself, as in saying it's become more triggered and activated within me. Or it might be something, a story I've started telling myself about my partner, and I'm starting to look for this confirmation bias and really feed into that story. Or am I, just reacting to a dynamic where I don't feel very emotionally safe to soften into this dynamic? So if we have this way of wanting to soften into our relationships, and I will just say this, when we talk about softening into relationships, we're not talking about being weak. We're not talking about being overtly feminine. We're not talking about being performative. We're not talking about putting on a show and behaving a certain way. Being soft is a nervous system state. Being soft is our ability to really just breathe into our relationship and kind of be in the present moment with that person and not have to feel guarded and tense in our body and our nervous system and in our heart and mind. When we are wanting to work on like creating this new way of being open and finding this new softness and really just kind of being present and breathing, there's a few things that we can do. One is obviously starting to track your nervous system state. Again, I get it. It's not sexy and it's not fun and it's not the relationship answer that everyone wants. But once you start to work as an individual on your own nervous system and know where you're kind of at, you can literally tell when you are like tensing in front of people or like being like, this doesn't feel good in my body right now. And that gives you an opportunity to go like, okay, is this something that I'm protecting myself from? Or is this something that I'm picking up with them that I'm just not quite gelling with? So there's ways that obviously we can work with this. This is where we have our tools that we kind of learn on our own inner healing journey, where we've got our emotional regulation, our self-regulation, our reparenting, learning to work with our nervous system, tracking our nervous system. And there's all these things that we can kind of do on our own and really start to notice where we are at. And let's say that we go back to that situation where my partner has like not turned up on time, and I'm angry and I'm frustrated, and I'm like looking at myself and I'm going, oh my God, like, why am I getting so frustrated at this? Is this to do with something to do with him? Is this something to do with myself? I can then take those tools and that strategies to work backwards and figure out like, what is the root cause of this? Like, what is behind all this? And maybe there's a little old part of old Simi that just needs like a little bit of love from when she was that 16-year-old girl that hadn't been felt and heard and seen. Now, obviously there's the individual work of that. So like taking that information and like going and processing that on your own through different methods, whether that's journaling or seeing, a psychologist, whatever it might be, whatever works for you. But there's also the secondary part of that, because there's only so much inner healing that we can do on our own. Part of working on our relationships is then taking that stuff that we learn on our inner healing journey and being able to use it in real time in our relationships. And what that requires is being in that moment and being in the dysregulated state and learning to soothe and work through that with that person, but also in a way that is beneficial to the relationship and not bleeding onto them. So as soon as they kind of come into that restaurant, like, you're not just going to be like, oh my God, and this is what happened, and and kind of go through your entire process, because they're not your therapist. But you also want to be able to go through that experience and be like, okay, now when they're here, how can I shift my tune? Because this isn't about them. This is about 16-year-old Simi that didn't get seen and loved and heard in all the ways that she did. So it's very much that process of working on my own nervous system regulation, working on my regulation in the moment, and being able to ask myself questions and come back to finding out what's really behind it in the moment of those triggers and that activation. And then also that part of being able to work through it with that person available in front of me. And that's where we see the real progression between our own inner healing journey and moving into a healthy, secure relationship, and using those tools and strategies to build healthy relationship skills. Doing all of this inner work is so amazing and incredible, but it's not very viable if we're not able to then take that and turn it into healthy, happy relationship skills where it feels soft and genuine, and we're able to enjoy life without having to be rigidly within the work. Now, I will just say this, if you're like, I get all of this, but I don't know where to feel into my body. I don't understand where my nervous system is at. Like, how do I really know? This is where it gets a little bit woo for some people. I don't think it's woo at all anymore because I've been doing it for so long, but some people are still resistant to it. Literally go into a body scan meditation. The more you physically feel into your body, and the more that you go to the gym and you track and you feel that muscle, or you're really actually consciously connecting to your body, the more you'll be able to feel where your nervous system is at. And that's going to help you start to build resilience and start to break up between reaction and break up from incident to reaction. If you're listening to this and you're nodding along and you're like, yes, I am all these things where I struggle to, not be reactive, and I struggle with my nervous system, and I struggle, and it's no matter what I do, I just keep feeling my reactions win, and I try and bottle it in, and I try and squeeze it down, and it just pops out sideways, and I end up reacting, and I'm trying to soothe myself and nothing is working for me. I do want to talk to you about what I mentioned about the chronic stress response, because I find that if you are someone that it is at a point where you are I can't seem to get a hold on this, it's just too much. When we have a lot of experiences within our lives as an individual, it kind of pushes us outside of what we call our window of tolerance. So from my happy, connective state, I'm now in a sympathetic state, and I'm finding it a lot harder to get back into that connective state. And over time, what happens is I can get so outside my window of tolerance that I just oscillate between kind of this anxiety, stress out state and feeling totally shut down and totally exhausted, and I can't do anything. And the more we stay there, the more harder it is to actually come out of that. The harder it is, because our resilience basically gets really shot. If that is you, my biggest recommendation for you is to find someone that can work with you who is whether that's a psychologist or whether it's a trauma-informed breath work instructor, which is crazy if you are not someone who's heavily into this stuff. Some of you might be yeah, it makes sense. But I swear to God, breath work, you're what the hell has that got to do with any of this? But the whole point of working in transformational breath work is that it is the ability to hijack your nervous system like in real time. So what I mean by that is then I'm going to put myself into a stress response. And if I start to slow it down exhales, then I start to push myself into a parasympathetic nervous system response. And why this is really powerful is because when you are stuck in a stress response and you go and you do a transformational breathwork journey with someone who is trauma informed, I cannot say that enough, then basically what ends up happening is you go from this stress response, and by the end of that session, you will be out of that chronic stress response. You will have like dropped out of it and be able to be back into your body and start to make the biggest shifts that you can. And I love breath work. And I use it myself as when I feel like my nervous system is dealing with a lot and I don't know how to process that. And it's something that I have spent a lot of time teaching in somatics over the last year. But also within that as well, it's challenging because you also have like this ability where you want to take like breath work and talk therapy and like really put it into the same, because I think that sometimes when we are just working with the body or we're just working with the mind, it can be a bit of a miscommunication where you miss parts, because it's not just about what's happening in the nervous system. You also need to kind of figure out like, okay, like what's the patterns here, what's the things. And while I wish I could get my hands on everybody and work with everyone available, that's not realistic. So when I tell you, hey, if you think this is you and you want to find a practitioner, find someone who has a blend of both. Like that is going to be your key to making really progress change. A lot of people will maybe listen to this and be like, maybe I should go and do a transformational breathwork event. And I think that they are very powerful, but it is very difficult to do that and have the integration that you need and the understanding that you need. Please like look at doing a one-on-one first. If you find someone, and then once you've done one or two one-on-ones, then you can move to the events. I know from a price point that sometimes that might seem like the much better option, but I just would prefer you to do that in a way where coming out of a chronic stress response and learning to let go of this reactivity and all of these kind of things that you've been going through, there's a lot of little hurt parts behind there. So I want to make sure that I'm giving out some advice where you feel supported. So to sum it all up, wired for protection is where our nervous system is holding on to more than what it should be. We all kind of know by this point now that trauma is stored in the body. And while that saying itself can sound a little woo and a little confusing, ultimately what ends up happening is if we have a lot of negative past experiences that we haven't processed properly, our nervous system becomes hypervigilant to looking for threats that aren't necessarily there. We become in this state called negative sentiment override, where we start to misinterpret neutral or even positive signals as negative ones because we're starting to become hypervigilant and overly aware and so conscious and like almost this confirmation bias, like, is this person going to hurt me? Is my partner going to hurt me? Is my partner going to let me down? Am I going to go through this experience all over again? And these different hypervigilant states can also really stem from a lot of our self-limiting beliefs and the stories that we tell ourselves. And we end up becoming very wired to protection, and we protect ourselves more than what we should. It's a natural human survival response that we are wired for protection and not perception. When we are wired for protection, we ultimately are kind of born that way, right? Like we want to see a threat and respond accordingly. But when that becomes too much and when it becomes an overbalance and it starts to impact and hurt our romantic dynamics by self-sabotaging too soon, being reactive, shutting down, doing all of these things, then we know we have a problem. And it can be very difficult to work with the nervous system in that way because you can't always see it. The nervous system is very tricky. If you had asked me when I was stuck in my chronic stress response, if I thought I was in a chronic stress response, I never would have thought that. I would have told you that I was regulated, but I wasn't being really honest with myself about what was going on internally, but there were signs, right? And working with our nervous system is not the sexiest part, but I promise you guys, the more that you do this and the more that you're open to it and the more that you're willing to try, the more you're going to learn to soften into your relationships, the more you're going to build that secure backbone into finding healthy, secure love. The more you can do these things with the micro little ones that come up, the more you're able to work with the bigger ones that come up in those, attachment activations, like your anxious attachment or, your detachment strategies and avoidance. And you're able to really start to train this muscle of learning to work with your nervous system long term. Anyway, That is all from me today. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this little episode and it gives you guys a little bit more of a push into understanding how this all kind of weaves together and understanding the sneaky little ways that it turns up. Next week, we're going to be talking about softness in relationships. And I really felt like this was like a good preempt episode so that we can start to work from like a full circle moment of like this rigidness to becoming really soft and trusting and open and grounded, and what that might look like for you guys moving forward. I will see you guys next week.